everyone. Thank you for joining us for today's webinar. My name is Prithili Modak and I am the trainer at Modak Trainer Academy, a platform driven by vision and values. Today we are presenting Bhojpuri Folk Theatre Origins, Idiom and Development, presented by Shubhangi Srivastava. She is a research scholar at the Department of English, Guru Gobind Singh in the Prasth University, New Delhi. Her research area concerns Bhojpuri folk theatre. He has done her post-graduation from Jamia Millia Islamia and her undergraduation from Ambedkar University, Delhi. Her poems, stories, translation and articles have been published in the Black Sheep, the Indian Review, Borderless, Book for Life, the Criterion, Thespian Magazine, Creative Flight and the Indian Periodical. Now, without any further delay, we will turn the time over to Shubhangi Srivastava. Ma'am, please start your deliberation. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that lovely introduction. And as everybody already knows, I am Shubhangi. And before I delve into my lecture today, I would still want to just repeat my research interests. So I am a scholar of Videsia particularly. Videsia is a Bhojpuri folk expression, as we will see as we proceed further into today's lecture. So without any further ado, let's begin. So before starting the lecture, let's just look at the title of today's presentation. It's titled Bhojpuri Folk Theatre, Origins, Idiom and Development. So before we discuss the subtitle, let's focus on the main title, which is Bhojpuri Folk Theatre. Let's go one by one. So when we consider the word Bhojpuri, again, it's a very contested domain because is Bhojpuri a language? Is it a dialect? It is officially recognized as a dialect of Hindi, but again, a language is basically a communication system which has its own vocabulary, grammar, pronunciation rules. So, according to that criteria, Bhojpuri can very well be, presented as a language. But here comes the problem that it does not have an existing script, but it did have an existing script, which was the Cathy script. But over time, because of the colonial rule and whatnot, Hindi became the more dominant language of, especially specifically of North India and also Bihar, Jharkhand, and these regions. And so the Cathy script has been lost to time. So now Bhojpuri has been subsumed under this, the Hindi language, and it's now considered to be a dialect. So, in this lecture, why I'm giving this introduction is because in this lecture, Bhojpuri is not only language, Bhojpuri also refers to the culture, the tradition, and the people. So, in this title, Bhojpuri Folk Theatre, Bhojpuri, apart from being a language, it also, represents these things as well. Now we come to the second word of the title, which is folk. Folk again is a contested domain. According to American folklorist Alan Dundes, folk is anyone and everyone who share, or a group basically, a group of people that share at least one common characteristic. So according to this, this idea of folk, even this meeting, everyone who is present in this meeting right now is basically a folk group, because we are here, I am delivering this lecture, you are listening to me because we share at least one common factor. It could be knowledge, it could be, the desire for knowledge, it could be teaching, it could be anything else, right? So this is the basic understanding of folk. Traditionally and conventionally, folk is usually referred to, the rural population, right? But that is again a very outdated definition or understanding of folk, because we are living in the 21st century. Everything is a melting pot. Education is kind of accessible, more accessible now. I won't say it's accessible to everyone, but it is definitely more accessible than it was before, right? So with this understanding of folk, now let's shift to the third word, which is theatre. So I won't discuss the word theatre in detail, because I believe theater in this particular context or overall, it can be looked upon from various perspectives. So let's look at, if we look at it from theater perspective, the theater studies perspective, then, theater basically refers to an area where drama unfolds. It could be a folk, it could be folk settings, it could be an open air setting, it could be proscenium settings, right? But according to performance studies, theater is everything. Even what I'm speaking right now is basically a performance. I am performing in front of you. So even this is theater. You are witnessing a performance, right? You sitting, on the other side of the world, listening to my listening to my presentation is also a kind of performance, right? So even that is theater. So now that we have looked at the main title, let's shift our attention to the subtitles. Let's go one by one again. So when we talk about the origins of Bhojpuri folk theatre, uh, there is a big problem in tracing the origin of folk literature, because folk literature does not have a definite origin. That's what makes it folk, right? Variability is very intrinsic to folk literature. If it doesn't change, then it's not folk. And it could be explained with an easy example, because folk literature, at the very heart of folk literature, breathes the folk consciousness, which is the consciousness of the folk people. If it's not varying from time to time, then sadly, the folk are not changing basically. The huge gap in the study of academia of folk literature also aims to address this understanding of folk, and how can we successfully bring folk literature to the forefront, right? uh, in this lecture particularly, we will be looking at Bhikhari Thakur's folk theatrical tradition, which is renowned as Videsya. It is Videsya is the most prominent theatre form from Bihar. And in this lecture, Bihar refers to the undivided Bihar of the 20th century. Okay. So let's quickly come to Videsya. Now, Videsya can be very easily translated as foreigner in English, but in the folk theatrical sense, Videsya doesn't truly mean a foreigner. It more or less means a migrant, because it ultimately originates from the migration experiences of people. Now, Videsya is not only a folk theatre form, it also includes folk songs, folk tales, folk dances, folk art, and of course, folk theatre as well. Like I mentioned before, Videsya originates from the migration experiences. Now, when we discuss the history of Bihar, there are basically two major migration experiences that one discusses about. One is the migration that happened to adjacent cities like Calcutta. The other migration is basically the indenture era migration, which made people move from India to other, then British colonies like Mauritius, Trinidad, Tobago, Fiji, Guyana, and several other countries. So these are the two basic migrations that are primarily talked about. Bhikhari Thakur's plays focus more on the migration that happened to adjacent cities, primarily Calcutta, because Calcutta at that time was just like today. It has always been, this center of job opportunities, rich culture and tradition and values as well, right? So this is the basic historical context of migration in Bihar, which ultimately facilitated the origin or the emergence of Videsya as a folk tradition form. Now, let's also discuss a little about not the history, but a little background on Bhikhari Thakur. So, of course, he was not a trained playwright, if there is one. He was born in a Dalit family. He was born as a barber, and he worked as a barber because, according to the Hindu caste system, if you're born in a Nai family, then you have to follow that occupation. So for the longest time, he worked as a barber, and it was during these experiences as a barber that he traveled to several villages, several cities, several places. He met a lot of people. He talked to them. That is when he realized how ingrained and how deeply problematic this issue of migration is, and how much it is damaging the family dynamics. Now, a barber's significance is very important to understand, especially in context of Bihari weddings and other Bihari customs. So, a barber, which can be translated as a nai in Hindi, a barber is necessary for wedding processions, because he has to come and he has to, cut the groom's hair. And the barber's wife has to come and apply alta on the feet of women. Then in, tonsure ceremonies, the barber comes and, he peels off the hair. There are several other customs that require the presence of a barber. So this is why Thakur had to, travel to all these places. Uh, so in his plays, he also, during these travels, he also witnessed several other folk tradition forms. They include Jatra of Bengal, then, we have Tamasha of Maharashtra, then we have Nautanki of Uttar Pradesh, Ram Leela and Ras Leela, then also several other Dalit and tribal folk performance forms such as Dom Kach, Jat Jatin Ke Naach, then Netua Naach is also there, Jogira is there. So all of these folk performances inspired the theatrical idiom of the Hari Thakur, as we will see as we proceed further into this lecture. So in his plays, in the Hari Thakur's plays, migration is not only uh, seen as a seen as this movement or mobility of people. It's not just looked upon as this technical thing that happened to people. It also, discusses the political upheavals of its time, and more than anything, it focuses on bringing light to the voice of the people or the folk, the politics of everyday survival, and the impact of migration, specifically on wives who were left behind, children who grew up without a father, parents who struggled through old age, and several other things. So these were the real life incidents that basically inspired his theater. Now, the reason I have given this lecture the title Bhojpuri Folk Theatre and not Videsiya is mainly because Videsiya is a part of Bhojpuri Folk Theatre but doesn't really define it entirely. And I don't know if it's fortunate or unfortunate, but Videsiya is probably the only theatrical tradition from Bihar that is as prominent. So, and of course, I discussed, the various inspirations, the various influences of other folk performances on Videsiya. Now that we have understood why Videsiya originated and what was the intention behind it, let's just understand the second part of our subtitle, which is the idiom. Now, idiom is, I have to explain it in simple terms of a dictionary. It is a characteristic mode of expression in music or art. That is, how an artist uses an art form to put their point across. Now, if I add one more word to idiom and make it theatrical idiom again simply refers to the way a playwright or a dramatist uses theater to convey the politics and aesthetics that is relevant for the masses, be it folk theater or proscenium theater. Now, to understand Thakur's theatrical idiom, we have to look at certain points. So, there are several characteristic elements that make Videsiya Videsiya. Number one is, of course, Nach, the performance tradition of Nach. In recent decades, Nach has been renamed as Londa Nach in pop culture references, right? There are several scholars that argue that Londa as a prefix has been added because Nach as a performance tradition originated from within the Dalit masses. And of course, it did not sit right with the landlords who belong to the upper caste. So, of course, over time, it actually fell into the same exploitation cycle that it was trying to evade with this, with this performance ritual. And now when we see a Londa Naach being performed, it is usually, a vulgar display of bodily excess. Now, even this word vulgar is very contested. It's very problematic to use the word vulgar in an academic scenario, and it can be argued definitely. But in, the conventional, traditional sense, these performances are usually considered vulgar, right? So the performance tradition of Nach is very intrinsic to Videsiya. If there is no Nach, there is no Videsiya. So the Nach that Thakur incorporated in his theatre usually involved his own friends because he had this theatrical troupe of his own male friends. And Nach is a performance tradition where male performers wear feminine attire, wear excessive and exaggerated makeup. They they perform in a feminine manner on stage to demonstrate the female characters. Now there are several reasons behind this. Now, of course, it has become this endangered folk tradition performance, but also one of the major reasons why male performers had to put on feminine clothes was because women were not really allowed to perform on stage for the longest time. And Nat is not the only performance tradition which only allows male performers to perform on stage. In fact, there are several other folk traditions, folk performance traditions. where this is the case. But again, I mean, that is the beauty of folk traditions, basically, that there is a lot of overlap between folk traditions, yet, the name differs as the places differ, as the folk differs, right? So, number one is definitely Naach. The second one is costume. Now, of course, when we think of theater and we think of the costume that a theater uses, we often think of very brightly colored costumes, costumes that stand apart, right? In Videsia, very not surprisingly, really, but interestingly, these costumes were, the mundane costumes, the day-to-day costume, the day-to-day clothes that people used to wear. So more often than not, these male performers, they used to wear the saris or the dupattas of their own wives and daughters, and they used to perform. Now, this could also be understood as a very deliberate motive, a deliberate step on Thakur's part. He basically to make this performance more relevant to the masses, because if on stage people are wearing too gaudy outfits, too expensive outfits, of course it won't resonate that well with the folk audience that is sitting on the floor or on the trees, because that is how performances happen in villages, right? So again, costume is one. Then of course the folk songs, because in folk theater, most of the performance happens through folk songs and music. Dialogues are definitely there, but dialogues do not really drive the narrative as much as the folk songs do. So again, several types of folk song genres that already existed before Thakur's time. Several ones of them, like the Vilap Geet is there, Sanskar Geet is there, then Sorti is there, several other folk song genres that are included in Bihari Thakur's theatre. Then the next one is, of course, musical instruments, because music is again an integral part. If the folk songs are being performed alive, live by the performers, the folk music has to be live as well. So there is a live orchestra which majorly includes harmonium, dholak, tabla, and others. Uh, then, of course, we have stock characters, because in a folk audience, it doesn't have a limited sitting space as a proscenium theater. In proscenium theater, you have limited seats. If there are 50 seats, then only 50 tickets can be booked, and only 50 people can be in attendance, right? But in a folk performance, which usually happens out in the open and usually happens in rural or semi-urban areas, uh, people are sitting on the ground, people are also sitting on the trees, people are standing, people are sitting on each other's laps just to witness that performance, because most of these performances, they happen throughout the night, right? So to maintain that interest in the audience, among the audience, it becomes very necessary to incorporate all these elements that do not bore the audience. In proscenium theater, this is again one of the major criticisms, or critiques. More than criticism, it is a critique of proscenium theater, that a 2 hour play in a proscenium setting can get boring very easily. Why is that? Because there are, what captures our attention, dialogue doesn't really capture our attention as much as visuals do, as much as songs do, as much as music does, right? So this, again, this has been one of the major reasons behind the incorporation of these elements. And then, of course, the makeup done by these male performers, they wear very heavy, thick makeup, and almost in a grotesque style. And this could be understood as a tactic to safeguard these male performers from the ire of the society. Because if these male performers start wearing clothes or start wearing makeup in a perfectly feminine manner, then they can also be subjected to the same assault, same molestation that women have to go through. And that is exactly what is happening with Londa dance performers today. Because they wear perfectly feminine outfit, perfectly feminine makeup, which makes the distinction between which makes the distinction between feminine and not so feminine, very blurred. So again, the exaggerated makeup is a big element in Videsia. And also the exaggerated feminine movements by the male actors, because it captures the attendance. And also, if you're swaying your arms too much on the on the stage in a folk theater setting, even the person who is sitting at the back can see what the performer is doing on stage. So they have to exaggerate their motions. Then, of course, the breakdown of the sports ball. Now, again, the breakdown of the sports ball has been a is a very major topic in theater studies. But again, folk theater has been practicing it for literally centuries because the audience members are free to participate. Of course, they can't, they can go up to the stage and, like participate, but that would be hooliganism. So more than that, there is a part, there is a participation where they can clap, they can laugh with the actors, they can throw flowers at the the performers, or they can praise the performers midway, and the performers will also react back to the audience members. So of course, this breakdown of the fourth wall is also what makes the theatrical idiom of Thakur so unique. And now we discussed yeah, and the last one is of course the Videsiya Bhav. So Videsiya, as we have understood what Videsiya is, how it when translated could be understood could be understood as emotions. So Videsiya emotions. Now this terminology has been coined by author and scholar Badri Narayan in his book Cultural Economy of Migration, which was published with Routledge in 2021, I believe. And this terminology, according to Narayan, basically refers to the emotions, the emotional value of Videsiya performances, which makes it so relevant to the audiences that the audience does not want to leave, even if the performance is happening throughout the night. So these are some of the elements. Now we come to aesthetics. Now, aesthetics, if I explain it very simply, it could be understood as politics plus beauty. Now, uh, beauty in folk theater, specifically in the context of Videsiya, is made by the visuals, right? What makes up these visuals? All the elements that I discussed before. These are the elements that make the visual aspect of Videsiya so resonant with the audiences. So these make the performance beautiful, right? And when these elements are combined with the thematic concerns of the place, which basically include, the economic struggles of the rural folk, lack of employment opportunities, gender-based violence, caste-based discrimination. These are the thematic concerns that inform the politics of the place. And when they are combined, they form a mass appeal that reach the masses every time they witness a performance. Because mass appeal is again a very quintessential characteristic of folk literature. If it does not appeal to a mass, then sadly it's not folk literature, right? So I hope I'm clear till now. So now that we have you know discussed the theatrical idiom of Videsiya particularly, let's move to the development of Videsiya. Now, Thakur's legacy has been humongous for the Bhojpuri speaking population. In present day, of course, it includes Bihar, it includes Jharkhand, it includes some parts of Chhattisgarh, and also the eastern parts of Uttar Pradesh. Right, his legacy has been such as a folk figure that he is almost worshipped there. And because his legacy has cast such a long shadow, his plays, his writing, his performance style, the idiom set such a benchmark for Bhojpuri folk theatre that for the longest time we did not have a playwright who could carry forward this legacy for the contemporary audiences. And this, but that also doesn't mean that the performances were not happening. Of course, even after Vikhari Thakur died, his theatrical troupe was still active. His children were still, very actively pursuing these performances. So these performances were most definitely happening. But the gap was in the emergence of new playwrights who could write new plays in the Videsiya tradition. That is what was missing. So in the 1960s, uh, Satish Anand, who is a very renowned theatre practitioner, he found the Nirman Kala Manch in Patna with some of his friends who were also theatre practitioners. And from there, the journey of Videsiya from folk settings to proscenium settings began. Because, like I already mentioned before, the essence of folk lies in its variability. If it doesn't change, is it even folk literature? Even this change that I'm discussing, that I'm emphasizing, is not really drastic most of the times. But in its subtlety lies the beauty. On the surface, folk literature might seem stagnant, almost unchanging, but there is always a change happening with every new performance of folk traditions. Because every folk is different, every folk member is different, their understanding of folk literature is also different. Hence, their performance of folk literature is different. This is why folk literature, whenever it is attempted to pen down folk literature, be it folk songs, be it folk plays, folk tales, or whatever, it is always met with contestations, because how do we know that the version we are penning down is the original and not again a mutant produced by us? Even the plays, the extant plays of the Hari Thakur that we have now, even there, there is a huge argument among scholars whether these plays are as they were written by Thakur, or has there been some alterations done while the book was being edited by the editors. And we have these beautiful two volumes of the Hari Thakur's works, because he was not just a playwright, he also wrote folk songs, he also wrote some short stories, although those stories are not really I haven't come across one because they haven't yet, been revealed to the public. So in these volumes, we only right now we have access to his plays and his songs. So this is how folk literature usually functions, and this gap was very evident in the Bhojpuri theatrical scene, because after Thakur died, there, like I mentioned earlier, there was nobody to carry that legacy forward. His kids, his sons who were there, there are some documentaries on Bihari Thakur's family and how his legacy has been continued by his family, but none of them were playwrights. They organized these performances, but none of them wrote plays, wrote new plays. So when Nirman Kala Manch was established was founded in Patna in the 1960s, the proscenium performances of Bihari folk traditions began, which of course majorly includes the Bhojpuri folk theatre. And a special attention was, of course, provided to Bihari Thakur's theatrical areas. Now, not just his plays, the focus was also to develop several other modern Indian plays in the theatrical idiom of Videsia. So there are some Rakesh's plays that are available in the Videsia tradition. There is Charandas Chor that is available in the Videsia tradition. I believe all these performances have been archived and they can be found on Internet Archive. So this is how the development of Bhojpuri folk theatre was understood and carried forward by Satish Anand and his colleagues. Uh, the the playwright who emerged from this scene was Rishikesh Sulabh, who is still alive, who still writes today. He was the playwright who managed to write plays, and good plays that showcased the contemporary realities of the Bhojpuri speaking communities. His plays were more nuanced because they were written specifically for the proscenium audiences. So, of course, the politics was also more nuanced. In folk performances, of course, the playwright is also a little limited because he cannot include too much of dialogue. So it has to be said through performance. It has to be said through the performance of song. But in proscenium, you have the liberty to include more dialogues and less songs, which is exactly what is observed in Rishikesh Sulabh's plays. So Sulabh, took this responsibility, and he still writes. I don't think he writes plays anymore. He has written around 8 or 10 plays. He now focuses on writing short stories and novels, and he also won the Sahitya Natak Academy Award in 2021. So he has been very instrumental in developing Videsia in the contemporary times. Uh, some of his plays, of course, include Amali, and then there's Batohi. Batohi is inspired by the life of Bihari Thakur, although it's not, it's a fictional account basically. Uh, and this development of Bhojpuri folk theatre has been, I won't say it has been entirely successful, because again, Bhojpuri literature as a whole is again, very much overlooked in the especially in the academic scene and also in the performance traditions that are happening in proscenium settings. But Sulabh's and Anand's contribution to this development has managed to at least bring Bhojpuri folk theatre, specifically Videsia, out of its folk settings and also introduce it to the urban audiences. So first was, of course, the audiences, the urban audiences of Patna. And then now, of course, several performances have happened in, in places like MSD, also the Sri Ram Center, and just recently, the Bharat Rang Mahotsav that happened earlier this year in February, the Delhi one, it was kickstarted by a performance of Videsia, which was again directed by one of the directors of the Nirman Kalamanch. So the development is of course happening. It is a little slow because there are not many people on ground. And again, I believe there are several scholars who are working on this concept of the economic decline that that has plagued Bihar for the longest times. The lack of funds, the lack of research funds, as well as the funds that are required to arrange these performances for an audiences. All of these things have basically, resulted in sort of an endangerment of this folk tradition form, right? But of course, all these efforts towards the development are still happening, and a good point to bring here is also the development happening in the academic scene, because the academic study of folk literature is often looked upon in some sort of suspicion, because how can you write a thesis or a dissertation on a folk performance, right? Because the very essence of folk lies in its performance. When you pen it down, it almost becomes it becomes something that cannot be changed, right? So the very essence of folk lies in its performance. But still, because we are living in the 21st century, we have to, carry forward this, we have to kind of overcome this mentality that the academia is not sufficient enough to study folk literature, because that is not so. More and more scholars are taking up Bhojpuri folk theatre as their research interest. Not just the Bhojpuri theatrical scene or the Bhojpuri performance traditions of India, but also the Bhojpuri performance traditions of countries like Mauritius, Fiji, Guyana, Trinidad, Tobago, etc. Uh, and some of them, of course, focus on the textual analysis, which is also true, which is also, it can be done. Again, textual analysis of folk literature is often, again, looked upon in suspicion. But it is important to, textually analyze these plays, these texts as well, because only then will we understand the psychology, the politics, the aesthetics behind this literature, right? Some of the academic work, of course, focus on uh, developing the literature that is available on economic and political factors that influence this tradition in the first place. And migrations from Bihar, Jharkhand, this is still happening to this day. So Videsia is a very active tradition that is happening. There are tons of documentaries online that are available, but and all these traditions are also alive. Many of these traditions are not documented, but that does not mean that they are not happening. Women who are left behind, they are the ones who carry forward this legacy, because more often than not, the responsibility of carrying forward the culture rests on a woman's shoulders, especially in the rural scene, right? So many of these traditions are being developed in the folk settings as well. It is not only in academia, or it is not only in proscenium settings that this development is happening. It is also happening in the folk settings. And since Bhojpuri literature overall is heavily overlooked, even by people who belong to that region, there is a very evident research gap that needs to be addressed before the extant literature becomes extinct. So that was my presentation for today. And now I open the platform to the audience members if you have any questions or observations.